Throughout the course of history, there are many dates in which many important events can and will happen. Today we'll be looking at one particular event, and we'll explore the possibilities that would have happened had this event failed. This event happened about 68 years ago on the 6th of June back in 1944. This event was a military operation, an invasion, and to this day it is still known as the largest amphibious invasion known to man. It was known by many names: Operation Overlord, Operation Neptune, the Battle of Normandy, the Normandy beach invasions, but ultimately, D-Day. Before we start looking into what could have happened, let's rewind and look back at the operation itself. After Allied forces were kicked off of the beaches of Dunkirk, we were left out of the battle in Europe. We still had the Red Army in the Eastern Front and joint British and American forces fighting in North Africa and Italy, but these battles weren't enough to get us into the heart of the Axis powers, Germany. We needed to open up another front to fight the Nazis with, to occupy Axis lands somewhere other than Italy or Eastern Europe. We needed to establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied France by sending Allied armies onto beaches named Juno, Gold, Sword, Utah, Omaha. The Canadian forces landed on Juno Beach. British forces stormed Gold and Sword, while the American Army was responsible for Utah and Omaha. A lot of really careful planning went into the making of this operation, most importantly the so-called phony war in northern England. In order to trick German surveillance of the Allies, they set up a base in northern England where they stationed dozens of inflatable tanks. Every morning they would go out and create false tank tread marks and make it look like the tanks were driving around the base. All of this while they were blasting the sounds of tanks, jeeps, and soldiers on the move from radios to make the Axis powers think the Allies were mobilizing soldiers in northern England, all in an attempt to invade France somewhere north of Normandy. The Germans fell for it and began to fortify sections of Hitler's Atlantic Wall more in the north than they did in Normandy. Yet Normandy was still heavily fortified as it was still part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Hitler's Atlantic Wall stretched from the most northern part of Norway to the most southern point of France. This operation was an extremely complex one, as it involved 156,000 soldiers coming from infantry units and airborne units alike. D-Day was delayed many times due to bad weather, but on the 5th of June, Eisenhower gave the go command and the Allies went on their way, first by sending in the airborne. On June 5th, 1944, after Eisenhower gave the OK for Operation Overlord to begin, the airborne divisions received word of the start of the operation and began loading up their planes to leave for France. At about 1 to 2 a.m. on June the 6th, 1944, the American and British airborne forces flew over their designated drop zones in France. They first began to drop a special unit of airborne soldiers dubbed as Pathfinders. The jobs of the Pathfinders were to locate designated drop zones that were to be used by preceding airborne regiments, and mark these drop zones for pilots to see. The purpose of this was to make sure the pilots saw where the airborne men were to be dropped, so there would be absolutely no misdrops. However, the Pathfinders' presence eventually alarmed the Germans, and soon the sky was lit up with searchlights, flak, and anti-aircraft. Along with sudden German resistance and weather problems, miscommunication led to severe misdrops of all the airborne divisions. This rendered most of the Pathfinders' jobs useless, as people were dropped anywhere from 1 mile to 10 miles off target. All in all, nearly 45% of all men in the airborne that were dropped over France were misdropped. Even though there were misdrops, soldiers of the airborne units regrouped and began to take their objectives, which at the time were to destroy any and all big guns that could serve as a hazard for soldiers landing on Utah Beach, and clearing roads and villages behind the beaches to make life a bit easier for the infantry just landing on the beaches. Which brings us to the next phase, the amphibious invasions. At approximately 5 a.m., all 5 beaches began to see action from the Allied invaders. Infantrymen were lowered into LCUs and Higgins boats, which in turn took them to the edges of the beaches, lowered the ramps, and let the soldiers run out. Due to artillery, many boats could not make it to the edge of the beaches, and many soldiers were dropped into deeper parts of the beaches, stepping off the landing crafts into 6 to 7 foot deep, icy cold water. Equipped with all their extremely heavy gear, many soldiers sank down to the bottom and drowned, while the lucky ones were able to strip themselves of their gear and went through the invasion ill-equipped. During all this chaos, there were German mortars raining down on the men, with German MG-42s, hailing them with bullets, tearing to ranks upon ranks of men. Nonetheless, these men pushed through, climbed over seawalls and other obstacles, and fought off the German defenders, and in the end were able to establish the foothold needed in France. The war was won less than a year afterwards. Now that we know some of the specifics in the aftermath of D-Day, let's explore what would have happened had D-Day failed. Let's see what could have happened if all the airborne divisions failed their duties. The Germans knew exactly where we were landing and further increased their defenses. Let's look and see what could have happened if every last man storming the Norman beaches was killed and nobody else was left, resulting in the loss of about 156,000 men in the matter of about 5 hours. First, let's look at the consequences that would be directed towards the leaders. In case Operation Overlord failed, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces Dwight D. Eisenhower had prepared a short speech for such an occurrence. It goes as follows. Our landings have failed and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all bravery could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. This message would be broadcast on radios across America, Canada, England, and pretty much any other Allied country. German radios could have easily intercepted the speech and broadcasted it for propaganda purposes. The fact of the matter is that Eisenhower would have pretty much no credibility anymore due to such a massive failure of a key operation. Perhaps higher members of the brass might understand a failure every now and then is all but imminent, but civilians everywhere would have no faith in him, which would eventually lead to the loss of the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces himself, a major loss during the time of war. This brings us to the next issue, morale. The sudden loss of so much life would decimate any and all morale for the citizens of the United States, Canada, and Britain. The citizens of the nations involved will have a negative outlook on the war because of this loss of life, and most likely not support the war as much as they did before. People working in factories might have thought that it was pointless to fight a losing war, and the Allied war effort will slowly start to deplete, and over time, that rate will grow larger and larger. Eventually, even the soldiers who will have to deploy will lose interest, and the United States and any other Allied countries will secede from the war. As a side note following morale, the Germans and all the Axis powers would take this newfound win and use it for propaganda. Suddenly, they will feel stronger, for their country just repelled the largest amphibious invasion known to man, which in turn would greatly increase German morale, and more people would be encouraged to be a part of the war effort. Even the German soldiers would become more resistant and feisty with this new morale and pride. Moving on, we have to look at the greatest factor that can possibly be looked at. Remember, earlier on in this video, it was said that the war was won less than a year after D-Day. Obviously, this wouldn't have happened, and the war in Europe would have continued for a few years more. The war wouldn't have ended in 1945, and we would have lost more soldiers. When you look at this with more detail, it starts to come together. We lose 156,000 men, and we have no foothold in France. All we have to rely on is that the Russians push through German lines and into Berlin, or our boys in North Africa and Italy pull through and push through Europe. After that, we would have to again try to invade Europe. But now that we've already tried and failed, the Nazis would see another attack coming and would spare no expenses in defending and fortifying possible invasion zones. So a second invasion would be much harder to accomplish, not to mention that it would be harder to get approved, with the last great loss, and civilian approval would be at a bare minimum. Along with that, we would be losing much more lives throughout the war. The Allied forces already lost 156,000 soldiers, along with the losses for the next great invasion, and fighting the rest of the war, which also now has extra resistant German fighters from their new morale boost from the earlier failed invasion. This would easily spell doom for many a foot soldier. Now that we have looked at the consequences, we can easily say that if D-Day had failed, we would have seen a greater loss of life in the war and an increase in German defenses. The war would have indeed droned on for much longer than it actually did, and in the end, we would see a larger death toll from both sides. Given the circumstances stated previously, with extra resistant German fighters and a large war effort working force, which would also bring up the economy for Nazi Germany, the Allies would be forced to fight a much larger, stronger, and better equipped German army. This new and improved army would then kick the Allies off of North Africa, killing more soldiers and hold their positions. The stronger German war machine would then be fighting a substantially weaker England and America. Hitler's forces would then take advantage of this opportunity and occupy the weakened England. This event would severely affect the Allied powers greatly, as England was one of the big three. Hitler would then bring over his long-range rockets and V-2 missiles to use on America directly, which is also weakened at this time. Once America is at Hitler's knees with his rocket strikes, the Nazis would swarm in and take over America. Since Japan was also fighting with Germany against the United States, they too would gain American land from the treaty that would soon follow. It would be a total flip in roles from what actually happened. America would be split into East and West, just like Germany was at the end of World War II. Germany would take control of the east coast of America, while the Japanese would take control of the west coast of America. The western part of America would be ruled under Imperial Japan, while the eastern side would be governed under Nazism. The flip of roles would act just like it did in World War II, and we will see many similarities between East-West Germany and East-West America. First of all, the District of Columbia airlift would need to be put in effect, and there would be a giant wall erected in between the East and West American borders. Furthermore, history is always written by the victor, and since we lost the war, the Allies would be labeled as the bad guys, and generations of people to come would despise democratic Americans, with Democrats being treated with just as much respect as Nazis today. But we don't see much Nazis anymore today since they were eradicated, so the chance of seeing Democrats and Republicans would be just as slim. Today's government and pretty much life in general would be out of whack. And our automotive companies would have been the ones responsible for the VW bus, which technically would have been a Ford bus. Ew. All because we never held those beaches. But we did. Dodged a bullet there.